Margaret Bellamy was 71 years old, and she had been sleeping in a laundromat on Clement Street for 11 months and 6 days when her son saw her face on the evening news. He was sitting in a leather recliner in a 4-bedroom house in Scottsdale, Arizona, a glass of bourbon sweating on the armrest, and the remote was in his hand. And he was about to change the channel when the camera panned across a row of industrial dryers and settled on a woman curled beneath a wool blanket the color of dishwater, her white hair pressed flat against the side of a plastic chair, and he recognized the blanket before he recognized his mother. It was the same blanket she had kept folded over the back of the couch in the house where he grew up. The same blanket she had wrapped around his shoulders when he was 9 and had the flu, and she stayed up all night pressing cold washcloths to his forehead. He expected to feel shock. He expected guilt, maybe, or confusion. What he did not expect was the sound that came out of his own mouth. A low, fractured noise, something between a groan and a whisper. Because in that moment, watching a woman he had not spoken to in 4 years curl her knees toward her chest on a plastic chair in a public laundromat, he understood with absolute and irreversible clarity exactly what kind of man he had become. Margaret Ann Bellamy was born in 1952 in a town called Harlow Springs, Missouri, a place so small it didn't appear on most maps, and so quiet you could hear the grain elevator humming from 1.5 miles away. And she was the second of 4 children born to Wallace and June Bellamy, a couple who ran a hardware store on Main Street and attended the same Baptist church every Sunday for 43 consecutive years without missing a single service. Wallace was a man who believed that the measure of a person was whether they showed up to work, showed up to church, showed up when a neighbor's roof was leaking, or when the creek flooded the low road past Henderson's Dairy. June was a woman who could stretch a pound of ground beef into 3 meals and make each one taste like a different kind of love. Margaret grew up in a white clapboard house with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides and a garden in the back where her mother grew tomatoes and zinnias and one stubborn rosemary bush that refused to die even in the worst winters. Once she learned early that love was not a feeling but a practice, something you did with your hands. You kneaded it into bread dough. You pressed it into the seams of a quilt. You folded it into the blankets you tucked around your children at night. Margaret absorbed this lesson the way soil absorbs rain, deeply and without effort, and it became the organizing principle of her entire life. She was not a remarkable student. She was not especially beautiful, though she had a warmth in her face that made people want to sit next to her, a quality that had less to do with her features than with the way she looked at people, fully, without distraction, as though the person in front of her was the only person in the world. She graduated from Harlow Springs High School in 1970, worked at the hardware store for 2 years, and married a man named Gerald Tisdale in the spring of 1973. Gerald was tall and thin and had a laugh that sounded like something breaking in a good way. He worked at the grain elevator and later drove a delivery truck for a food service company and later still managed a small warehouse outside of Jefferson City. They were never wealthy. They were never poor. They lived in the middle, in that vast American territory of modest houses and reliable cars and grocery lists written on the backs of envelopes, and Margaret made that middle feel like more than enough. She had a gift for it, for making a house feel warm, for making a meal feel like an occasion, for making the people around her feel seen. She had one child, a son. She named him David. David Gerald Tisdale was born on March 14th, 1976. So you went from the moment he entered the world, 8 pounds, 4 ounces, 21 inches long, screaming with a fury that startled even the attending nurse. Margaret loved him with an intensity that frightened her. It was not the soft, diffuse love she had imagined during pregnancy. It was sharp and specific and physical, a tightness in her chest that never fully released, a constant low-grade awareness of his location, his breathing, his temperature, his mood. She was not an anxious mother. She did not hover, but she was attentive in a way that bordered on devotion, and David grew up inside the warmth of that devotion the way a seed grows inside good soil, steadily, confidently, reaching upward without ever having to wonder whether the ground beneath him was solid. Now, Gerald was a good father in the way that many men of his generation were good fathers, present but peripheral, reliable but emotionally reserved. He coached David's Little League team for 2 seasons, taught him to change a tire when he was 12, took him fishing at Lake of the Ozarks every June. But it was Margaret who knew David. She knew that he chewed the inside of his cheek when he was nervous. She knew that he read the same chapter of The Hobbit 4 times because he didn't want it to end. She knew that when he came home from school silent and went straight to his room, it meant something had happened with the Kessler twins, who teased him about his second-hand sneakers. And she knew that the best thing to do was wait 45 minutes and then bring him a glass of milk and a slice of whatever she had baked that morning and sit on the edge of his bed and not say anything until he was ready to talk. She knew him the way she knew her own body, instinctively, completely, without having to think about it. David was a bright boy who became a bright young man who became, by most external measures, a successful adult. He studied business at the University of Missouri, graduated in 1998, moved to Chicago, worked for a logistics company, then a consulting firm, then another consulting firm that paid better. He married a woman named Vanessa Okafor in 2004, a sharp, ambitious woman with a law degree and a family in Philadelphia who owned 3 dry cleaning franchises and spoke about equity and investment portfolios at Thanksgiving dinner. Vanessa was not unkind. She was efficient. She moved through the world with the brisk confidence of someone who had been taught that comfort was earned through accumulation, and she applied this philosophy to everything: her career, her marriage, her home, her social circle. She liked Margaret well enough in the abstract, appreciated her warmth, her cooking, her willingness to babysit, but she found Margaret's world small. The clapboard house, the Baptist church, the grocery lists on envelopes. The way Margaret still used a rotary phone until 2009 and still wrote letters by hand and still kept a garden even after Gerald died in 2011 of a heart attack that took him in his sleep, quietly, the way he had done everything. Vanessa saw Margaret's life as a cautionary tale. A woman who had never demanded more, never reached further, never leveraged her potential into anything beyond a warm kitchen and a well-tended garden. She did not say this aloud, not in so many words, but she communicated it in the way she sighed when Margaret told the same story twice, in the way she checked her phone during Margaret's descriptions of church events, in the way she gently, persistently, consistently redirected David's attention away from Harlow Springs and toward the life they were building in Scottsdale, where they moved in 2015 after Vanessa took a position at a firm that paid her more money in a year than Gerald had earned in any 5. Gerald's death broke something in Margaret that she did not know could break. She had always understood, intellectually, that he would die first. Men in his family did. It was almost a tradition, hearts giving out in their 60s like clocks winding down. But understanding it and living it were 2 entirely different countries, and she found herself stranded in the second one without a map. The house felt enormous without him. The bed felt obscene in its emptiness. She would wake at 3 a.m. and reach across the mattress and find cold sheets and lie there in the dark, listening to the house settle and creak, and she would think, "This is what the rest of my life sounds like." She did not fall apart, and she was not the kind of woman who fell apart. She got up every morning at 6:15, made coffee, tended the garden, attended church, visited the hardware store that was now a gift shop, talked to her neighbors, called David every Sunday at 4 p.m. Central Time. She maintained the structure of her life with the same stubborn discipline her mother had used to maintain the rosemary bush, not because it was thriving, but because giving up on it was not an option. But something had dimmed. The warmth was still there, the kindness, the attentiveness, but behind it now was a tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. She was tired of being the only one in the house, tired of eating alone, tired of the way silence could feel like a physical weight pressing on your sternum. She missed Gerald in specific, to almost embarrassingly mundane ways. The sound of his key in the lock at 5:45, the way he hummed while he read the paper, the weight of his hand on her shoulder when he passed behind her chair. These were not grand losses, they were small ones, but they accumulated the way snow accumulates, flake by flake, so gently you barely notice until one morning you open the door and you cannot get out. For 3 years after Gerald's death, Margaret managed. She paid the bills, Gerald's pension and social security, covered the mortgage and utilities with a little left over for groceries and the occasional treat, a book from the library sale, a new pair of gardening gloves. She kept the house in reasonable repair, hiring Johnny Whitfield's boy to fix the gutters and the porch railing when they needed it. She maintained her Sunday calls with David, and which lasted between 12 and 22 minutes depending on whether Vanessa was home. When Vanessa was home, the calls were shorter. David's voice changed when Vanessa was in the room. It became more clipped, more businesslike, as though he were conducting a meeting rather than talking to his mother. Margaret noticed this, but did not comment on it. She had learned, over many years, that pointing out the ways your adult child has changed only accelerates the change. She asked about his work. She asked about Vanessa. She asked about the house in Scottsdale, which she had never seen. She told him about the garden, the church, the weather. She said, "I love you," and he said, "Love you too, Mom." And the difference between those two phrases, the difference between "I love you," deliberate and complete, and "love you too," unreflexive and abbreviated, was a distance she could feel but could not name. In 2014, the first real crack appeared. Margaret was 62, and her left hip had begun to ache in a way that made climbing stairs an exercise in controlled grimacing. The doctor in Jefferson City told her she needed a hip replacement, a procedure that would require surgery, a hospital stay, and 6 to 8 weeks of recovery during which she would not be able to live alone. She called David. She explained the situation. She did not ask him to come. She asked him if he could suggest what she should do. There was a pause on the line that lasted 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds, Margaret heard everything she needed to hear. David said he would look into options. He said he would call some places. Up here he said maybe there was a rehabilitation facility nearby where she could stay during recovery. He did not say, "I'll come." He did not say, "You'll stay with us." He did not say, "Don't worry, Mom, we'll figure this out together." He said he would look into it. Margaret had the surgery 3 months later. She spent 4 days in the hospital and then transferred to a rehabilitation center in Columbia, Missouri, where she shared a room with a woman named Doris, who had fallen off a step stool while changing a light bulb and broken both wrists. David sent flowers. He called twice during her stay, once to ask how the surgery went, and once to tell her that Vanessa had been promoted. Margaret spent 6 weeks in that facility, learning to walk again on her new hip, eating meals on a plastic tray, watching television shows she did not care about, or when talking to Doris about their children. Doris had 3, all of whom visited regularly, rotating in shifts so she was never alone on a weekend. And Margaret listened and smiled and said how wonderful, and she did not cry until Doris fell asleep, and even then she cried quietly into the pillow, the way she had been crying since Gerald died. The years that followed were a slow erosion. Not dramatic, not violent, just the steady, patient wearing away of connection, like water over limestone, until what had once been solid became hollow. David called less frequently. The Sunday calls shifted to every other Sunday, then to the first Sunday of the month, then to whenever he remembered, which was roughly once every 5 or 6 weeks. Margaret always answered on the first ring. She kept the phone on the table next to her chair. What volume turned up, and when it rang, she felt a jolt of adrenaline that was out of all proportion to the event. A 70-year-old woman lunging for a telephone as though it were a life preserver. The calls grew shorter. David's life in Scottsdale was busy. There were conferences, client dinners, golf outings with Vanessa's partners, a renovation of the kitchen that cost more than Margaret's entire house was worth. He talked about these things with an enthusiasm that Margaret tried to share, but it was like trying to feel warmth through glass. She could see it, she could not touch it. She told him about the garden. She told him the rosemary bush had died, finally, after all those years. She told him she had started volunteering at the church food pantry on Wednesdays. He said, "That's great, Mom." He said, "You're keeping busy." And he said it as though her life were a hobby, something to occupy her time rather than the sum total of her existence. In 2017, Margaret lost the house. It happened the way catastrophes happen to people without resources, not all at once, but in a cascade of small failures that each seemed manageable until they weren't. The roof leaked, the furnace failed. The property taxes went up. Gerald's pension, which had seemed adequate when he died, was being eaten alive by inflation and medical costs. Her blood pressure medication, her hip pain management, a dental emergency that cost $2,300 because she had no dental insurance. She took out a small loan. She missed a payment. She took out another loan to cover the first. She missed that payment too. The math was simple and merciless. Her income was $1,640 a month. Her expenses were $1,890. and the difference was $250 a month. And that $250 compounded month after month after month, quietly, relentlessly, the way a cavity eats through a tooth, invisible until the whole structure collapses. She did not tell David. She could not bear to tell David. She could not bear to hear the pause. She could not bear to hear him say he would look into it. She sold the furniture first. Then the car, the 2003 Honda Civic that Gerald had bought, used and maintained with religious dedication. Then the jewelry, what little there was, her mother's pearl earrings, her own wedding ring, a gold bracelet Gerald had given her for their 20th anniversary. She sold these things at a pawn shop in Jefferson City, standing at a glass counter across from a young man who looked at her with a mixture of pity and professional detachment and offered her $340 for everything, and she took it because $340 was 2 weeks of groceries and a payment on the second loan, and she walked out of that shop with the strange lightness of someone who has just lost something they will never get back and knows it. The foreclosure notice came on a Tuesday in September. She had known it was coming. She had known it the way you know winter is coming. You can feel it in the air, in the angle of the light, in the way the world begins to withdraw into itself. And she stood on the porch of the house where she had lived for 41 years, and she read the notice twice, and she folded it carefully and put it in her purse, and she went inside and made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the room, the countertop where she had kneaded 10,000 loaves of bread, the window above the sink where she had watched David play in the backyard, the scuff marks on the floor where Gerald used to push his chair back after dinner. And she understood that she was looking at these things for the last time in the way that they had always existed, as the architecture of her life, and that soon they would just be walls and floors and countertops in someone else's house, emptied of all the meaning she had pressed into them over 4 decades. She had 30 days. She called David. She rehearsed what she would say. She would be calm. She would be clear. She would explain the situation without drama, without tears, without making him feel guilty. She dialed the number. It rang 5 times. Vanessa answered. Margaret said hello. Vanessa, is David there? Vanessa said he was in the shower. Margaret said, could he call me back? It's important. Vanessa said, sure, I'll let him know. David did not call back that night. He did not call back the next day. On the 3rd day, Margaret called again. This time, David answered. She told him about the house. She told him about the foreclosure. She told him she had 30 days, well, 27 now, and she did not know where she was going to go. There was a silence. It lasted longer than 4 seconds this time. It lasted long enough for Margaret to hear the television in the background, some sports broadcast, the sound of a crowd cheering at something that had nothing to do with her. David said, Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner? And Margaret almost laughed, because the answer was so obvious and so painful that she could not believe he needed to ask it. Because you would have looked into it, she thought. Because you would have made calls and sent a check and felt like you had done your duty and gone back to your life. Because I didn't want your money, David. I wanted you. But she did not say any of this. She said, I didn't want to worry you. David said he would figure something out. He said he would talk to Vanessa. He said there were programs, there were resources, there were senior living facilities that were affordable. He said he would send her some links. Links. The word landed in Margaret's ear like a stone dropped into still water. Her son, her only child, the baby she had held against her chest and sworn to protect with every molecule of her being, was going to send her links. The call ended. David sent the links the next day. 3 senior living facilities in Missouri, none within 50 miles of Harlow Springs, ranging in cost from $2,400 to $4,100 per month. Margaret looked at these numbers on the screen of the second-hand smartphone David had sent her for Christmas 2 years ago, still in its original box until the church volunteer had helped her set it up, and she felt something she had not felt since Gerald's funeral. Not grief, exactly. Not anger. Something colder than both. The recognition that she was, in the most fundamental sense, alone. Where that the person she had built her entire life around, the person she had fed and clothed and nursed through fevers and read to sleep and driven to school and worried about every single day for 41 years, had just suggested she solve the greatest crisis of her life by clicking on a link. She did not click on the links. She could not afford the links. She packed what she could carry into 2 suitcases and a canvas bag: clothes, her Bible, a photo album, the wool blanket from the couch, a small wooden box that contained Gerald's watch, David's first baby tooth, and a photograph of her parents standing in front of the hardware store in 1968. And she left the house on Maple Street for the last time on a Friday morning in October, locking the door behind her with a key she placed in an envelope and mailed to the bank. Once she took a Greyhound bus to St. Louis because she had a cousin there, or thought she did, a woman named Patty who had sent Christmas cards until 2010. The address Margaret had for Patty turned out to be a nail salon. The woman behind the counter said she didn't know any Patty. Margaret stood on the sidewalk with her 2 suitcases and her canvas bag and the wool blanket folded over her arm, and she looked at the city, the traffic, the noise, the buildings, the people walking past her without seeing her. And she thought, this is what disappearing looks like. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in stages. First you lose your husband, then you lose your house, then you lose your son, not to death, but to something worse than death, to indifference, to the gravitational pull of a life that has no room for you. And then you lose your address, and without an address, you lose your name, because in America, you are where you live, and if you live nowhere, you are no one. She spent the first 3 nights in a shelter on North Tucker Boulevard, a large, echoing room with cots arranged in rows and a smell of disinfectant and sweat and something else, something harder to name, something like the collective exhale of 70 people who had all arrived at the same terrible destination by 70 different roads. Margaret lay on her cot with the wool blanket pulled to her chin and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds: coughing, crying, murmuring, the squeak of shoes on linoleum, a woman somewhere reciting the Lord's Prayer in Spanish. And she thought about the bed on Maple Street, the way the mattress had held the shape of Gerald's body for months after he died, and she pressed her face into the blanket and breathed in and tried to find his smell, but all she could smell was industrial detergent and age. The shelter had rules. You had to be out by 7 a.m., you could return at 6 p.m., you could stay for a maximum of 30 days. Margaret followed the rules. She left every morning at 7 with her canvas bag over her shoulder and walked. She walked because walking was free, and because walking gave the day a structure, and because if she stopped walking, she would have to sit somewhere and thinking was the most dangerous thing she could do. She walked to the public library and sat in the reading room until noon. She walked to a church on Delmar that served lunch on weekdays, a bowl of soup, a roll, and a cup of coffee, and she ate slowly, making the meal last because eating slowly made time move differently, made it feel less like something that was happening to her and more like something she was choosing to do. She walked to a park and sat on a bench and watched pigeons and squirrels and children and felt the strange vertigo of existing in a world that was continuing without her participation. After 30 days, the shelter told her she needed to move on. There was a waiting list. There were younger women, women with children, women in more acute crisis. Margaret understood. She did not argue. She packed her things and walked out and stood on the sidewalk and considered her options and found that she had none. That was the day she found the laundromat. It was on Clement Street, a half-mile from the shelter. See a small storefront with a faded awning and a hand-painted sign that read, "Quick Clean Laundromat, open 24 hours." She went inside because it was November and it was cold, and the laundromat was warm. Warm in the deep, humid way that only laundromats are, the heat radiating from the dryers mixing with the smell of detergent and fabric softener to create an atmosphere that was, if not comfortable, at least bearable. She sat in a plastic chair against the back wall. She put her bag on her lap. She watched people come and go, young mothers with baskets of children's clothes, college students with garbage bags of laundry, a man in a mechanic's coverall feeding quarters into a machine with hands stained black. No one looked at her. No one asked her anything. She was invisible, and for the first time since losing the house, invisibility felt like a mercy rather than a punishment. She stayed until the last customer left at 11:30 p.m. The owner, a Korean man in his 50s named Mr. Park, came out from the back room to lock up and found her sitting in the chair with the blanket over her legs. He looked at her for a long moment. He did not ask her what she was doing there. He did not tell her to leave. He said, "You can stay if you're quiet." He turned off the overhead lights but left the one above the folding table on. He locked the front door from the inside and went back to his room in the back, and Margaret sat in the chair in the dim light and listened to the machines cool and tick and settle, and she closed her eyes and slept the first uninterrupted sleep she had gotten in 31 days. That was how it began. Or not with a decision, but with an absence of alternatives. Mr. Park, whose full name was Park Jun-ho, and who had come to St. Louis from Busan in 1992 with a wife and 2 daughters and $4,000 and a belief that America was a place where hard work was rewarded, a belief he still held despite evidence to the contrary, did not ask Margaret to explain herself. He did not ask where she came from or why she was alone or what had happened to the people who should have been taking care of her. He simply allowed her to stay. Every night, after the last customer left, he would nod to her and turn off the lights, and she would arrange herself in the plastic chair, 2 chairs pushed together actually, with the wool blanket folded beneath her for padding and then over her for warmth. And she would sleep. In the morning, at 5:45, Mr. Park would come out and unlock the front door, and Margaret would fold the blanket and put it in her bag and go to the library or the church or the park, and she would return at 10 p.m. and sit in the back and wait. It was not a life. It was the scaffolding of a life, the minimum structure required to keep a human being from collapsing entirely. Margaret knew this. She was not delusional. She was not at peace. She was surviving, and surviving was the only verb available to her, and she conjugated it every day. I survive, I am surviving, I will survive. With the grim determination of a woman who had been taught that giving up was not an option, even when every logical analysis suggested it was the only option left. She tried to maintain herself. She washed her clothes in the laundromat. Mr. Park let her use a machine for free on Tuesday mornings when business was slow. She bathed at the shelter, which let former residents use the showers on Mondays and Thursdays. She kept her hair brushed and her clothes as clean as she could, and she carried herself with a posture that said, I am a person, I have dignity, I am not what has happened to me. But the months accumulated. The cold came and went and came again. Her hip ached in the plastic chair. Her hands, which had once kneaded bread and pruned roses and pressed warmth into everything they touched, became dry and cracked and stiff. She developed a cough in February that lasted through March. She lost weight, not dramatically, not dangerously, but steadily, the way a candle loses wax, so the substance of her diminishing so gradually that only someone who had known her before would have noticed. No one who had known her before was there to notice. She did not call David. She had called him once, 3 weeks after arriving in St. Louis, from a payphone outside the library. He had answered. She had told him she was in St. Louis, that the cousin hadn't worked out, that she was staying at a shelter temporarily while she figured things out. He had asked if she needed money. She had said no. This was a lie, but it was the only lie she could live with, because the alternative, saying yes, I need money, I need help, I need you, would have required her to believe that he would actually come, and she could not survive the disappointment of discovering that he wouldn't. He said, Okay, Mom, call me if you need anything. She said, Okay, David. She said, I love you. He said, Love you too. She hung up the phone and walked back to the library and sat in the reading room and opened a book and stared at the same page for 45 minutes without reading a single word. 11 months. 11 months of plastic chairs and industrial warmth and the sound of dryers tumbling and the smell of other people's clean laundry. 11 months of invisible existence in a city of 300,000 people, not one of whom knew her name except Mr. Park, who called her Mrs. B, and a woman named Charlene at the lunch church who called her sweetheart, and a librarian named Maria who noticed that Margaret always sat in the same chair in the reading room and one day brought her a cup of tea without being asked. These 3 acts of recognition, a nickname, an endearment, and a cup of tea, were the pillars that held up Margaret's sense of self during those months. She was not nobody. She was Mrs. B. She was sweetheart. She was the woman in the reading room who liked Earl Grey. These were small identities, fragile as paper, but she held onto them the way a climber holds onto a rock face, with her fingertips, with everything she had. It was a local reporter who changed everything. Her name was Dana Whitfield, no relation to Johnny Whitfield's boy back in Harlow Springs, though Margaret would have appreciated the symmetry. And she was 28 years old, and she worked for KMOX-TV, and she was doing a segment on homelessness among elderly women, a phenomenon she described in her pitch to her editor as one of the fastest growing and least visible crises in the country. Young Dana had spent 3 weeks visiting shelters and parks and soup kitchens, interviewing women over 60 who had fallen through every net the system had to offer, and on a Thursday evening in September, she walked into the Quick Clean Laundromat on Clement Street because a social worker had told her about a woman who slept there, and she found Margaret sitting in the back row of chairs with the wool blanket on her lap and a paperback novel from the library in her hands. Dana asked if she could talk to her. Margaret said she didn't know what she had to say that would be interesting. Dana said she thought Margaret would be surprised. They talked for 2 hours. Margaret did not tell her everything. She did not mention David by name, did not describe the foreclosure in detail, did not explain the links, but she told enough. So she told Dana about Gerald, about the house on Maple Street, about the garden, the rosemary bush, the 41 years. She told her about the hip surgery, the shelter, the 30 days. She told her about Mr. Park, who let her sleep in the laundromat and never asked for anything in return. She told her about the wool blanket. She said it was the last thing she had from home. Dana recorded all of this on a small digital device, and when Margaret was finished talking, Dana sat very still for a moment, and then she asked, "Mrs. Bellamy, do you have children?" And Margaret looked at her hands and said, "I have a son." And Dana said, "Does he know you're here?" And Margaret said, "He knows I'm in St. Louis." And Dana said, "Does he know you're sleeping in a laundromat?" And Margaret said, "No." And her voice when she said it was the voice of a woman who had been carrying something so heavy and for so long that the muscles required to carry it had fused into permanent position, so that even setting it down would be an act of reconstruction. The segment aired on a Tuesday evening at 6:15 p.m. It was 4 minutes and 30 seconds long. It showed Margaret in the laundromat, the row of machines behind her, the blanket on her lap. It showed Mr. Park folding towels and speaking in accented English about how Margaret was a good woman, a quiet woman, how she never caused trouble, how he could not understand a country that let its grandmothers sleep in plastic chairs. It showed the lunch church on Delmar and Charlene ladling soup and saying there are more of them than you think, more old women alone than you think, and nobody sees them because nobody wants to see them. And it showed Margaret's face in close-up, the lines around her eyes, the thin white hair, the way she held the blanket with both hands as she spoke, and she said something that Dana had not asked her to say, something that emerged from the 11 months of silence and cold and invisible existence the way water emerges from rock, not because it chooses to, but because the pressure leaves it no other way. She said, "I don't blame him. I don't blame my son. He has his own life. I just wish..." And she stopped, and she pressed her lips together, and she looked directly into the camera, not at Dana, at the lens, as though she could see through it to wherever her son might be. "I just wish he knew that I'm still here. That's all. I'm still here." David saw this at 7:15 p.m. Mountain Time, but he was in the recliner. Vanessa was in the kitchen. The bourbon was in his hand. His mother's face was on the screen. Her voice was coming through the speakers of a 65-inch television mounted on the wall of a living room that cost more to furnish than Margaret's entire house had been worth, and she was saying, "I'm still here," and the ice in his glass was rattling because his hand was shaking and he did not move for a long time after the segment ended. He sat there through 2 commercial breaks and the beginning of the weather report, and he stared at the screen and he heard nothing and he felt everything. The guilt was not a wave. A wave suggests something that arrives and recedes. This was a flood. This was the entire ocean dropped on his chest at once. He thought about the phone calls, the ones he made and the ones he didn't. He thought about the links. The links. He had sent his mother links. He had sent his mother, the woman who had held cold washcloths to his forehead through the night, who had sat on the edge of his bed with a glass of milk and waited for him to be ready to talk, who had loved him with a ferocity that he had taken for granted, the way you take the ground for granted. He had sent her links to places that cost more than her income and expected that to constitute care. He thought about the phone call when she told him about the foreclosure. He thought about the 4-second pause. He knew now what she had heard in that pause. He knew now what she had heard in every pause, every shortened call, every love you too that was missing its first word. See, he knew because he was sitting in a leather recliner in a 4-bedroom house in Arizona, and his mother was sleeping in a laundromat in Missouri, and the distance between those two facts was not 1,500 miles. It was the distance between the man he thought he was and the man he actually was, and that distance was so vast and so ugly that he could not look at it directly. Vanessa came into the room. She said something about dinner. She saw his face. She said, "What's wrong?" He said, "My mother is homeless." He said it flatly, without inflection, the way you say something that is so incomprehensibly terrible that emotion cannot attach to it yet. Vanessa said, "What?" He said, "She's sleeping in a laundromat in St. Louis. She's been there for almost a year. She was just on the news." Vanessa stood very still. So to her credit, and David would give her this credit later when he had the capacity to be fair, she did not say anything defensive. She did not say we sent her links. She did not say she never asked for help. She did not say any of the things she could have said to distribute the blame. She looked at David and she saw something in his face that she had never seen before. Not guilt exactly, but the annihilation of the story he had told himself about who he was. And she said, "We need to go get her." She said it simply, practically, the way Margaret might have said it, and it was the kindest thing she had ever said to him. David drove through the night. He left Scottsdale at 9 p.m. Mountain Time on a Tuesday and arrived in St. Louis at 2 p.m. Central Time on Wednesday, when he did not fly because flying would have required planning. Booking a ticket, packing a bag, getting to the airport, and planning would have required thinking, and thinking would have required him to sit with what he had done, and he could not sit with it yet. Not yet. He needed to be moving. He needed the highway unspooling in front of him. He needed the physical act of driving toward his mother to feel like he was doing something, rather than simply being the man who had failed to do anything for 4 years. He drove 17 hours with 3 stops for gas and 1 for coffee, and he did not turn on the radio because he did not deserve music or news or anything that might distract him from the enormity of what he was driving toward. Vanessa stayed home. She would prepare the guest room, she said. She would stock the refrigerator, and she would make the house ready. David understood that this was her way of participating, practically, efficiently, and he was grateful for it, even as he understood that no amount of preparation could make that house ready for what was coming, which was not a guest, but a reckoning. He found the laundromat at 3:30 p.m. It was exactly as it had appeared on television: the faded awning, the hand-painted sign, the row of machines visible through the plate glass window. He sat in the car for 11 minutes. He counted. 11 minutes of sitting in a rental car on Clement Street, gripping the steering wheel with both hands, staring at the door of the laundromat, trying to figure out what to say to a woman who had given him everything and received nothing in return. He could not figure it out. There were no words sufficient. Why, there were no words at all, actually. Just the raw fact of what he had done and what he had failed to do. And the only possible response to that fact was not a speech, but a presence, not an explanation, but a body walking through a door. So he got out of the car and he walked across the sidewalk and he pushed open the door and a little bell chimed above his head and the warm, humid air hit him like a memory. Not laundromat air, not detergent and fabric softener, but something deeper, something that reminded him of being small and clean and safe. And he looked down the row of machines to the back of the room and he saw her. She was sitting in the same chair. The same blanket was on her lap. She was smaller than he remembered. That was the first thing he noticed. How small she had become, how the substance of her had diminished, not as though the world had been slowly erasing her and was almost finished. Her hair was thinner. Her hands, resting on the blanket, were knotted with veins and dry skin. She was wearing a blue cardigan he did not recognize and shoes that were too big for her feet. She was reading a paperback novel, holding it close to her face the way people do when their eyes are failing, and she did not look up when the bell chimed because people came and went all day, and none of them were ever for her. He stood there. He stood in the doorway of a laundromat on Clement Street, and he looked at his mother, and he felt something crack open in his chest. Not his heart, that was too simple, too sentimental. Something structural, something load-bearing. A wall he had built between himself and the knowledge of what he had done. And it cracked, and through the crack poured everything he had been holding back for 4 years, every unanswered phone call, every shortened conversation, every love you too that was missing its first word, and he said, "Mom." Just that. One syllable, one word, the first word he had ever learned to say. She looked up. She looked at him over the top of the book, and her face did something he would never forget. A sequence of expressions that passed across her features in the space of 3 seconds: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and then something he did not have a name for, something that was not joy and not relief and not forgiveness, but contained all three the way white light contains all colors, an emotion so complete and so compressed that it could only be expressed as stillness. She did not move. She did not stand. She sat in the plastic chair with the blanket on her lap and the book in her hands, and she looked at her son standing in the doorway of a laundromat in St. Louis, Missouri, and she said, "David, you came." He crossed the room in 6 steps. He knelt on the linoleum floor beside her chair, and he took her hands, those dry, cracked, diminished hands that had once held him and fed him and pressed warmth into everything they touched, and he held them against his face and he said, "I'm sorry." He said it again. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." And she put her hand on his head the way she had when he was a child, when he was small and sick and frightened, and she ran her fingers through his hair and she said, "You're here now." She said it as though it were enough, as though 17 hours of driving could compensate for 4 years of silence. As though one act of arrival could redeem 1,000 acts of absence. It could not. They both knew it could not. But she said it anyway, because she was Margaret Bellamy, and she had spent her entire life turning insufficient things into enough, stretching a pound of ground beef into 3 meals, making a middle-class life feel like abundance, transforming a plastic chair in a laundromat into something survivable. And if she could do that with ground beef and wool blankets and rosemary bushes that refused to die, she could do it with this. She could take her son's late, broken, desperately insufficient return, and she could hold it in her hands, and she could make it into something that might, with time and effort and the stubborn refusal to stop loving, become enough. Mr. Park came out from the back room, and he saw the man kneeling on his floor, holding the old woman's hands, and he stood very still for a moment, and then he nodded once, slowly, as though confirming something he had always believed, and he went back into the back room and closed the door to give them privacy. David stood up. He wiped his face. He said, "I'm taking you home." And Margaret looked around the laundromat, the machines, the chairs, the folding table, the fluorescent light above it that had been her nightlight for 11 months, and she said, "Let me say goodbye to Mr. Park." She stood up slowly, her hip protesting, and she folded the blanket over her arm, and she walked to the back room and knocked on the door. And when Mr. Park opened it, she took his hand and held it in both of hers, and she said, "Thank you. Thank you for letting me stay. Ari, thank you for not asking questions. Thank you for being kind when the world forgot how." Mr. Park looked at her, and his eyes were bright, and he said, "You were never any trouble, Mrs. B. You take care of yourself." She nodded. She walked back to her son. She picked up her canvas bag and her 2 suitcases, the same ones she had packed a year ago, containing everything she owned in the world, and she walked out of the laundromat and into the sunlight, and she did not look back. The drive to Scottsdale took 18 hours. David drove. Margaret sat in the passenger seat with the blanket on her lap, and the window cracked 2 inches because she said the air felt good, and for the first 3 hours, neither of them spoke. The silence was not hostile. It was the silence of 2 people who had so much to say that the words had formed a logjam somewhere between their hearts and their mouths, and nothing could move until something gave way. It was Margaret who spoke first. She said, "The garden died." She said it quietly, looking out the window at the Missouri landscape scrolling past, the fields, the grain elevators, the water towers, the geometry of a state she might never see again. And David said, "I know, Mum." And she said, "The rosemary bush too, after all those years." And he said, "I know." And she said, "Your father would have been upset about the rosemary bush. He always said it was tougher than both of us." And David felt something shift in his chest, not the crack from before, but something gentler, a settling like a house adjusting to a new weight. And he said, "Tell me about Dad. Tell me about the garden. Tell me about the rosemary bush. Tell me everything." And Margaret looked at him, really looked at him the way she used to, fully, without distraction, as though he were the only person in the world. And she began to talk. She talked about Gerald and the garden and the rosemary bush and the porch and the hardware store and the blanket and the bread and the Sunday mornings and the weeknight dinners and the way the light came through the kitchen window in October, golden and slanted, painting everything amber. And she talked for 3 hours without stopping, and David listened without interrupting, and the highway unspooled in front of them, and behind them the laundromat grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, not from Margaret's memory, never from her memory, but from her present tense, so replaced by the warm interior of a car and the sound of her own voice telling the story of her life to the only person in the world who needed to hear it. Vanessa was standing in the driveway when they arrived. The house was lit up behind her, every window glowing, and she had done something David had not expected. She had planted rosemary. 2 small bushes, one on each side of the front door, in terracotta pots, still bearing the tags from the garden center. They were small and thin and frankly pathetic looking, and they would probably die in the Arizona heat within a month, and Vanessa clearly knew nothing about rosemary or gardening or what the gesture meant, but she had done it. And the fact that she had done it, that she had driven to a garden center and asked someone what rosemary looked like and bought 2 plants and put them in pots and placed them by the door, was an act of imagination that Margaret recognized immediately for what it was. Not an apology, not an explanation, an attempt. Vanessa walked to the car and opened Margaret's door and said, "Welcome home, Margaret." And Margaret looked at the rosemary bushes and she looked at Vanessa and she said, "They'll need more water than you think." She said it gently with the ghost of a smile, and Vanessa said, "I was afraid of that." And Margaret said, "I'll show you." The guest room was on the first floor. Vanessa had made the bed with white sheets and a quilted comforter and had put a glass of water and a small vase of flowers on the nightstand. So Margaret stood in the doorway and looked at the room, the clean walls, the soft carpet, the window with curtains that could be opened or closed. And she put her suitcases on the floor and she sat on the edge of the bed and she pressed her palms flat against the mattress and she felt the give of it, the softness, the way it held her weight without complaint, and she closed her eyes. 11 months of plastic chairs, 339 nights of sleeping upright in a laundromat with a blanket over her legs and the sound of dryers cooling in the dark. She lay back on the bed and pulled the comforter to her chin, and she stared at the ceiling, and it was white and smooth and still. Nothing like the stained acoustic tiles of the laundromat or the cracked plaster of the shelter, and she let herself feel what she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time, which was safe. Not happy, not whole, not healed, safe. The absence of danger. The presence of walls and a door and a lock and people on the other side of that door who knew her name. It was not enough. It was not nearly enough. But it was a start, and Margaret Bellamy had built her entire life on starts, on seeds and dough and the stubborn refusal to believe that something small could not become something sustaining. The weeks that followed were not easy. They were not the montage of reconciliation that David had imagined during the drive. Tearful conversations, followed by laughter, followed by healing, followed by wholeness. Everything resolved in a week, a month, a season. Reality was messier than that. Reality was Margaret waking at 3 a.m., Antia not knowing where she was, and reaching for the wool blanket in a panic. Reality was David trying to apologize, and Margaret saying, "You don't need to apologize," and David saying, "Yes, I do, Mom, yes, I do," and Margaret saying, "The past is the past," and David saying, "The past is the reason you slept in a laundromat for a year. Mom, the past is not the past. The past is right here in this room." Reality was Vanessa trying too hard, and Margaret being too polite, and both of them circling each other with the careful choreography of 2 people who did not yet know if they could trust each other. Reality was Margaret's pride, which was as stubborn as the rosemary bush. She did not want to be a burden. She did not want to be a project. She did not want to be the cautionary tale that Vanessa had always feared she would become. The reality was the doctor's appointment David insisted on, the first medical examination Margaret had received in 2 years, and the results: high blood pressure, early-stage osteoporosis, a vitamin D deficiency so severe the doctor said it was remarkable she could still walk, a persistent respiratory infection from 11 months of sleeping in humid air. The doctor looked at David and said, How long has she been living like this? And David could not answer. He opened his mouth and no sound came out, and the doctor waited and then moved on to the treatment plan. And David stood in the hallway afterward with his hands in his pockets and stared at the linoleum floor and understood that the answer to the doctor's question was long enough. Long enough for her body to start giving up, even though her spirit refused to. Margaret healed. Slowly. Not completely. 71-year-old bodies do not regenerate. They accommodate, they adapt, they find new equilibriums, but measurably. Her weight stabilized, her cough resolved. The color returned to her face, not the flush of youth, but a warmth that had been absent for months, the visible evidence of adequate nutrition and sleep, and the absence of fear. She took over the rosemary bushes, which she relocated to the backyard where they would get afternoon shade, and she began a small garden, tomatoes, peppers, herbs, in raised beds that David built on a Saturday morning, while Vanessa looked up soil composition on her phone and ordered bags of organic compost with the same efficiency she applied to legal briefs. Margaret watched them working together in the yard, David hammering, Vanessa researching, and both of them slightly out of their depth, and she felt something she had not felt since Gerald was alive. Not happiness exactly. The conditions for happiness. The raw materials, the soil, the seeds, the water, the light, everything needed for something to grow. David did not forgive himself quickly. Margaret forgave him before he forgave himself. Forgave him the way the creek ran after rain, fully and without conditions, because that was how she had always loved, and she did not know another way. But David carried the knowledge of what he had done like a stone in his chest, and some nights, after Margaret had gone to bed, he would sit in the living room and look at the chair where she sat during the day, the recliner he had bought for her, repositioned near the window where the light was best. And he would think about the plastic chairs in the laundromat, and the stone would press harder, and he would close his eyes and breathe and try to understand how a person, how he, specifically David Gerald Tisdale, who loved his mother, who had always loved his mother, could have let it happen. The answer, when it finally came, was not dramatic. It was banal. It was the banality of comfort. He had been comfortable. His life in Scottsdale was comfortable. And comfort, he now understood, was a kind of anesthesia. It didn't eliminate the pain of others, it just made it possible not to feel it. Every unanswered phone call, every shortened conversation, every love you too that dropped the eye. Each one was a tiny injection of numbness. And over the years, the numbness had accumulated until he could sit in a leather recliner and drink bourbon while his mother slept in a laundromat 1,500 miles away and feel nothing. Not cruelty, not malice. Nothing. And nothing, he now understood, was worse than cruelty because cruelty at least required awareness. Nothing required only the turning of a head, the changing of a channel, the clicking of a link. He began to call Mr. Park. Every month, on the first Tuesday, he called the Quick Clean Laundromat on Clement Street and asked Mr. Park how he was doing and whether there was anything he needed. Mr. Park said he was fine. David sent him a check anyway, $500 every month, made out to Park Junho with a note that said, "Thank you for keeping my mother alive." Mr. Park cashed the first check and used the money to buy a new dryer. But he cashed the second check and used the money to install a small cot in the back of the laundromat, a real cot with a mattress and a pillow and a blanket for the next person who needed a place to sleep. He told David about this during their third phone call, and David sat on the edge of his bed and put his hand over his eyes and wept, not for himself, not for his mother, but for a man from Busan who had looked at an old woman sleeping in a plastic chair and done the thing that David should have done. The simplest thing, the most fundamental thing, the thing that cost nothing and was worth more than everything. He had seen her. He had let her stay. Margaret lived in Scottsdale for 2 years. She tended the garden. She cooked meals that made the kitchen smell like Maple Street. She taught Vanessa how to make bread. Real bread. Unkneaded by hand, the kind that took hours and filled the house with warmth. And Vanessa, to her own surprise, loved it. She loved the patience it required, the physicality of it, the way it forced her to slow down and pay attention and use her hands for something that wasn't typing or swiping or scrolling. Margaret and Vanessa did not become close in the way that movies suggest. They did not have a tearful breakthrough, a single conversation that resolved everything. What they had was quieter than that, and in some ways more durable. They had Tuesday mornings when they made bread together and talked about small things: the garden, the weather, a book Margaret was reading, a case Vanessa was working on. They had mutual respect. They had the recognition that they were both stubborn women who had survived in different ways, and that stubbornness, which had once driven them apart, could also hold them together. On a Sunday afternoon in April, 2 years after David brought her home from the laundromat, Margaret was sitting in the recliner by the window, reading a novel, when she looked up and saw the rosemary bushes through the glass. They had not only survived, they had thrived. They were dense and green and aromatic, their branches reaching outward and upward with the determined sprawl of plants that have found the right soil. She had moved them 3 times, adjusted their water schedule, pruned them back when they got leggy, and now they were flourishing in a place no one would have predicted: a backyard in Scottsdale, Arizona, 1,500 miles from Harlow Springs, on Missouri, in soil that was nothing like the soil they had started in. She looked at the rosemary bushes, and she thought about her mother's rosemary bush, the one that had refused to die for 40 years, and she understood something she had not understood before. The bush had not survived because the conditions were ideal. The conditions had never been ideal. Missouri winters were harsh, the soil was heavy, the drainage was poor. The bush had survived because someone had tended it. Someone had paid attention. Someone had refused to give up on it year after year through frost and drought and neglect, and that refusal, that stubborn, daily, unglamorous act of care, was the only thing that had ever mattered. Not the soil, not the climate, not the conditions, the tending, the showing up, the refusing to let go. David came into the room. And he said, "Mom, you want some tea?" She said, "That would be nice." He went to the kitchen and she heard the kettle and the clink of a cup and the small, ordinary sounds of her son making her a cup of tea, and she closed her eyes and listened, and the sounds were not unlike the sounds of the laundromat, the hum, the warmth, the rhythmic regularity, except that these sounds were not the machinery of survival. They were the machinery of love. Imperfect love. Late love. Love that had failed catastrophically and was now, slowly, painstakingly, being rebuilt from the ground up, the way you rebuild a garden after a hard frost, not by pretending the frost didn't happen, but by starting again, one seed at a time in whatever soil you've got. He brought her the tea, Earl Grey. He remembered. He sat down across from her and he said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." She looked at him. He said, "I'm going to call you every day. Not because I feel guilty, not because I'm trying to make up for what I did, because I want to hear your voice. Because I missed 4 years of your voice and I'm never going to miss another day." She looked at him for a long time. She looked at him the way she had always looked at people, fully, without distraction, as though he were the only person in the world. And then she said, "When the phone rings, I'll answer." She said it simply. She said it the way she said everything. With the quiet certainty of a woman who had survived the worst thing that could happen to her and had emerged on the other side not whole, not unscarred, but still here, still tending what could be tended, still making insufficient things into enough, still pressing warmth into everything her hands could reach. If you're listening to this right now, if you're sitting somewhere in the dark with your phone or your screen and there is someone in your life you haven't called, a mother, a father, a grandparent, someone who loved you before you knew what love was and who is waiting right now for the sound of your voice, I want you to understand something. The laundromat is not a metaphor. It is a real place on a real street where a real woman slept in a plastic chair for a year because the person she loved most in the world forgot to love her back. Not out of cruelty, out of comfort, out of the easy, anesthetized. And day by day, forgetting that happens when your life is full and someone else's life is empty, and you do not have to see the emptiness because it is 1,500 miles away and you have changed the channel. The phone is in your hand right now. The call takes 30 seconds to make. You do not need to say anything profound. You do not need to apologize for everything. You just need to say, "I'm still here." Because that is what Margaret wanted. Not money, not links, not solutions. Just the knowledge that somewhere in the world, the person she had given everything to still knew she existed, that she was still here, that she had not disappeared. You can give that to someone right now. Tonight, before you go to sleep, pick up the phone, dial the number. When they answer, and they will answer on the first ring. They have been waiting. Say the only thing that matters. Say, I'm here. Say, I love you. Say it with the first word. Say all of it. Because you do not get the time back. You do not get the years back. You do not get the 11 months of plastic chairs and wool blankets and cold nights back. But you get this moment, right now. And this moment, if you use it, might be enough.